The old man's trembling hand slipped from the hospital bed and reached into the empty air just moments before midnight. Tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks as he whispered to someone who wasn't there. Every nurse on the floor had grown used to his nightly grief and walked past his room in silence. But one young nurse stopped, held his hand, and stayed beside him until dawn. She had no idea that this simple act of kindness would bring a stranger into her life and change her future forever. Before we begin this touching story, if you believe that kindness and second chances can change lives, please like this video, comment below, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel, Kindness Hub. Your support helps us bring more heartwarming stories to people around the world. The young nurse's name was Marissa Hale. At 28 years old, she worked long night shifts at a small private hospital in the city of Crestwood. Her life was far from easy. She lived in a tiny apartment above a grocery store and spent nearly all her earnings paying medical bills for her younger brother, Rowan, who suffered from a chronic kidney disease. Every morning after finishing her shift, she returned home exhausted, prepared meals, and helped her brother with his medications before sleeping for only a few hours. Marissa had once dreamed of becoming a pediatric specialist, but life had other plans. Their parents had died in a traffic accident years earlier, leaving her responsible for raising Rowan. She never complained. She simply worked harder. Among all the patients in the hospital, there was one man who captured her heart. His name was Cedric Whitmore, an 82-year-old retired schoolteacher. He had been admitted after suffering a mild stroke and needed constant supervision. Every night, when the hospital became quiet and the lights dimmed, Cedric grew restless. He stared out of the window, whispered old names, and cried softly. The other nurses believed he suffered from confusion caused by old age, but Marissa sensed something deeper. One evening she sat beside him and listened carefully. She learned that Cedric had lost his daughter many years ago to an illness. His wife had passed away shortly after, and his grandson had moved away to build a successful career. Although his grandson sent money and arranged for the best doctors, Cedric felt abandoned and terribly lonely. From that night on, Marissa made it a habit to visit his room during every shift. She brought him warm tea, adjusted his blankets, and listened to stories from his past. He told her about his days as a teacher and the hundreds of children whose lives he had touched. He described the beautiful garden he once kept behind his house and the little pond where his grandson used to feed ducks. For the first time in months, Cedric smiled. Their friendship became the brightest part of Marissa's difficult days. Sometimes she read books to him. Other times she simply sat beside him while he slept. She never realized that security cameras recorded these late-night visits. Far away in another city, a man named Everett Sterling spent most of his life inside boardrooms and luxury hotels. At 34, he had built one of the country's largest construction companies. Newspapers called him the silent billionaire because he rarely spoke to the press and kept his personal life private. Despite his success, Everett carried guilt in his heart. Years earlier, after his parents died, his grandfather Cedric had raised him. But as his business expanded, Everett became consumed by work. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. Eventually, months passed between meetings. When he received the news that his grandfather had suffered a stroke, he immediately arranged the finest medical care. Yet business emergencies prevented him from visiting. One rainy night, the hospital director called Everett personally. She explained that his grandfather's health was stable but his loneliness worried everyone. Then she mentioned a nurse named Marissa who stayed beside him every night. Curious, Everett asked to see the security footage. What he watched left him speechless. He saw the young nurse gently helping his grandfather sit up. He saw her laughing at his stories and patiently listening to his fears. He saw her covering him with an extra blanket before returning to her duties. She cared for him as if he were her own family. For the first time in years, Everett felt ashamed. The next morning he cancelled every meeting and drove straight to Crestwood. When he entered his grandfather's room, he found Cedric smiling while Marissa arranged fresh flowers beside the bed. Neither of them knew who he was. Marissa politely greeted the stranger and excused herself. Cedric looked at his grandson with tears in his eyes. That day became one of the most emotional reunions of Everett's life. He stayed for hours listening to stories he had missed and promised to visit more often. Before leaving, he asked the hospital director about the nurse who had cared for his grandfather. She explained Marissa's difficult circumstances and how she often worked extra shifts to pay her brother's medical expenses. Everett could not stop thinking about her. Over the following weeks, he visited the hospital frequently. Each time he arrived, he found Marissa helping someone. She comforted frightened patients, held the hands of those in pain, and treated everyone with remarkable kindness. She never expected anything in return. One evening, Everett stayed late and watched her sit beside Cedric's bed. The old man looked happier than he had in years. Something changed inside him. He realized that success had made him rich but not compassionate. This young woman possessed a warmth that money could never buy. Days later, Cedric was discharged. Before leaving, he hugged Marissa and thanked her for bringing joy back into his life. The hospital felt strangely empty afterward. Marissa returned to her routine, never expecting to see either man again. Then tragedy struck. Her brother's condition suddenly worsened. Doctors informed her that he urgently needed an expensive treatment they could barely afford. Marissa took additional shifts and sold nearly everything she owned. Still, the amount was impossible to gather. One night she sat alone in the hospital cafeteria and quietly cried. At that exact moment, Everett happened to be visiting his grandfather and saw her through the window. He approached and gently asked if she was all right. For the first time, she told someone about her struggles. She explained how she feared losing the only family she had left. Everett listened silently. He remembered all the nights she had spent comforting his grandfather without expecting anything. The next morning, he made several phone calls. But he chose not to reveal his identity or intentions. Instead, he contacted a medical foundation owned by his company and arranged for Rowan's treatment to be fully covered under an anonymous charitable program. When Marissa received the news, she could hardly believe it. She cried with relief. For the first time in months, she felt hope. The treatment began immediately, and Rowan slowly started recovering. Marissa repeatedly asked the hospital who had paid the expenses, but nobody knew. Meanwhile, Everett continued visiting his grandfather and occasionally crossed paths with her. A quiet friendship developed between them. They shared coffee during late evenings and spoke about their dreams. Marissa believed he was merely a successful businessman who cared deeply for his grandfather. She had no idea he was one of the wealthiest men in the country. As weeks passed, Everett found himself looking forward to their conversations more than any business meeting. He admired her strength. She admired his gentleness with his grandfather. One afternoon, Cedric invited Marissa to his house for tea. When she arrived, she was stunned by the enormous estate. Only then did she realize the true identity of Everett Sterling. She felt embarrassed and wondered why he had never mentioned it. Everett explained that he wanted to be known as a person, not as a billionaire. That evening they spent hours talking in the garden while Cedric watched them from the window with a smile. The old man understood something neither of them had yet admitted. They had changed each other's lives. Months later, Rowan recovered enough to return to college. Marissa finally allowed herself to dream again. One sunny afternoon, she received an envelope from the medical foundation. Inside was a letter revealing the identity of the anonymous donor. It was Everett. She sat in stunned silence. Suddenly every mysterious event made sense. The covered expenses, the special arrangements, the unexpected opportunities. She immediately went to see him. When she arrived, Everett stood beside the little pond his grandfather had once described. Before she could speak, he apologized for keeping the secret. He explained that he never wanted her to feel indebted. He had simply wanted to repay the kindness she showed an old man everyone else had forgotten. Marissa's eyes filled with tears. She realized that the greatest gift had never been the money. It was knowing that kindness truly comes back in unexpected ways. Please take a moment right now and comment, "Kindness always returns," if you believe one small act of compassion can change someone's destiny. As the golden evening sunlight reflected across the pond, Marissa thanked Everett not for saving her brother, but for restoring her faith in people. 1 year later, Cedric's garden was blooming again. The old man spent his afternoons watching his grandson and Marissa plant flowers together. The lonely patient who once cried every night now laughed more than ever before. He often said that miracles do not arrive with noise. They come quietly through ordinary people with kind hearts. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Hub, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support allows us to continue sharing stories that remind the world that compassion still exists. And as the sun disappeared behind the trees, Cedric looked at the two people standing beside him and realized that the nurse who comforted him every night had unknowingly healed 3 hearts instead of 1.